My name is Frank Castellano, and 3 years ago, my world ended with a knock on the door. I'm telling you this story because sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead to the most unexpected grace, and because my daughter Jessica would want me to share what happened next. I was 62 years old when two Army officers in dress uniforms stood on my front porch in Riverside, California, on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021. The moment I saw them through the peephole, I knew. Every military parent knows that knock, fears that knock, prays they'll never hear that knock. But there they were, their faces grave and professional, holding the news that would split my life into before and after. "Mr. Castellano?" the younger officer said, his voice carefully controlled. "We regret to inform you that your daughter, Staff Sergeant Jessica Marie Castellano, was killed in action while serving in Afghanistan." Jessica, my Jess, 26 years old, medic with the 101st Airborne, the girl who used to patch up every stray animal in the neighborhood and decided at age 8 that she wanted to help people for a living. She'd been deployed for 7 months, and we talked every Sunday morning when the time zones aligned. She'd called just 3 days before, laughing about something one of her fellow soldiers had done, telling me about the local children who waved at their convoy every morning. She was providing medical aid to civilians caught in an IED explosion. The officer continued. "A second device detonated while she was treating the wounded. She died instantly, sir. She didn't suffer." They used words like heroic and sacrifice and served with honor, but all I heard was the silence that would fill every Sunday morning for the rest of my life. They handed me a folded flag and some paperwork, offered resources for grief counseling, and then they were gone, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. Jessica's mother, Maria, had died of breast cancer when Jess was 16. It had just been the two of us after that, figuring out how to navigate the world without the woman who'd been our anchor. Jessica threw herself into school and eventually the military, while I threw myself into work at the aircraft plant and the one passion we'd shared, motorcycles. I'd bought my first Harley in 1978, a used shovelhead that I rebuilt in my garage over 6 months. Maria thought I was having a midlife crisis at 34, but she came to love those weekend rides through the California mountains. When Jessica turned 16, she insisted on getting her motorcycle license too. "If I'm going to be a Castellano," she'd said with that stubborn smile she'd inherited from her mother, "I need to know how to ride." We'd spent countless weekends on the road together, father and daughter, both on Harleys, exploring every scenic route within a 500-mile radius of Riverside. Jessica rode a Sportster, bright red, with custom flame decals she'd designed herself. She was fearless on that bike, leaning into turns like she was dancing with the asphalt, her laughter carried back to me on the wind. When she deployed to Afghanistan, Jessica asked me to take care of her bike. "Keep her running, Dad," she'd said the night before shipping out. "I want to take you on a ride to celebrate when I get home." Her Sportster had been sitting in my garage for 7 months, covered with a tarp, waiting for a homecoming that would never happen. The first few weeks after the notification were a blur of funeral arrangements, military honors, and well-meaning neighbors bringing casseroles I couldn't eat. Jessica's unit sent her personal effects, NDTs, photos, letters, the small cross Maria had given her years before. Everything except what mattered most. Her voice, her laugh, her presence filling up the quiet spaces in our house. I found myself spending hours in the garage, not working on anything in particular, just sitting between my fat boy and Jessica's covered Sportster. Sometimes I'd pull the tarp back and stare at her bike, remembering the day we'd bought it together, how excited she'd been to customize every detail. The flame decals had been her idea. "We're Italian, Dad. We do everything with passion." My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, started checking on me daily. She'd lost her own son in Iraq a few years earlier, and she recognized the signs of a man drowning in his own grief. "Frank," she'd say, bringing me coffee and forcing me to eat something, You can't just sit in that garage forever. Jessica wouldn't want this for you. But the garage was the only place I could still feel close to her. Out there, surrounded by the tools we'd used together and the bikes we'd ridden together, I could almost hear her voice asking about compression ratios or teasing me about my old-fashioned riding gear. The rest of the house held memories too, but they felt fragile now, like looking at photographs behind glass. In the garage, the memories felt real enough to touch. 3 months after the funeral, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to sell Jessica's Sportster. Not because I wanted to, but because keeping it felt like I was creating a shrine to death instead of celebrating her life. Jessica had always been about movement, about going somewhere new, about the next adventure over the horizon. Her bike sitting static under a tarp wasn't honoring her memory, it was burying it. I posted the listing on several motorcycle forums and classified sites. 2017 Harley Sportster, I wrote. 12,000 miles. Custom flame decals. Excellent condition. Owner deceased. Serious inquiries only. I included photos that showed every detail she'd been proud of. The custom seat, the upgraded exhaust, the way she'd positioned every chrome accent. The responses came quickly. Motorcycle enthusiasts, collectors, young riders looking for their first Harley. But one message stood out from the rest. It came from a guy named Tommy Kowalski, who said he was a member of the Riverside chapter of the Hells Angels. Mr. Castellano, Tommy's message read, I saw your listing for the Sportster. I'm interested in the bike, but I want you to know why. I lost my younger brother in Afghanistan 2 years ago. He was a Marine, 23 years old, and he loved motorcycles like we do. I'd like to buy your daughter's bike, not just for myself, but to honor her service and your sacrifice. If you're willing to meet, I'd like to hear about Jessica and tell you about my brother Danny. I stared at that message for a long time. In all the responses I'd received, no one else had mentioned Jessica by name or acknowledged what the bike represented. Tommy Kowalski, a Hell's Angel, someone I might have crossed the street to avoid a few years earlier, was the only one who seemed to understand that he wasn't just buying a motorcycle. He was becoming the guardian of someone's dreams. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Riverside. I arrived early, nervous about what kind of man I was about to encounter. My preconceptions about motorcycle clubs came mostly from movies and news stories. Leather-clad outlaws with violent tendencies and criminal connections. But when Tommy walked in, he looked like any other middle-aged guy you might meet at work or church. Average height, graying beard, wearing jeans and a simple black t-shirt. The only hint of his club affiliation was a small pin on his jacket collar. Mr. Castellano, he asked, extending his hand. I'm Tommy. Thank you for meeting with me. For the next 2 hours, we sat in that coffee shop and shared stories about our lost children. Tommy told me about Danny, his younger brother who'd joined the Marines straight out of high school, who'd been killed by a roadside bomb while on patrol outside Kandahar. I told him about Jessica, about her dream of being a medic, about the Sunday morning phone calls I'd never receive again. The thing is, Tommy said finally, when you lose someone like that, everyone wants to tell you how to grieve. They want you to move on, find closure, get back to normal. But there is no normal anymore. There's just learning how to carry the weight of missing them. He was right. For months, I'd been surrounded by people offering advice about healing and moving forward, but Tommy was the first person who understood that some losses aren't meant to be gotten over. They're meant to be carried, honored, transformed into something that keeps their memory alive in the world. If I buy Jessica's bike, Tommy said, I want you to know it won't just disappear into some collection. I'll ride it. I'll take care of it. And when people ask about the flames, I'll tell them about the Army medic who loved to ride and died saving other people's lives. I sold Tommy the Sportster that afternoon. But more than that, I gained something I hadn't expected. A friend who understood that grief isn't weakness, It's love with nowhere to go. Tommy invited me to come by the clubhouse sometime. Said the other members would want to meet Jessica's father. I thanked him, but wasn't sure I was ready for that kind of social interaction. What I didn't know was that Tommy had already told his brothers about our conversation. And what I definitely didn't know was that the Hells Angels Riverside chapter was about to teach me something profound about family, honor, and the unexpected places where healing can begin. A week later, I was in my garage again, staring at the empty space where Jessica's Sportster used to be. The absence felt different now, not like a wound, but like a seed planted in soil I couldn't see. For the first time since the officers had knocked on my door, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still a reason to keep going. I had no idea that my story was already spreading through a network of writers who understood loss, who honored sacrifice, and who were about to prove that sometimes angels wear leather jackets and ride Harleys. The next chapter of my life was about to begin with the rumble of engines and a brotherhood I never knew existed. 2 weeks after Tommy Kowalski bought Jessica's Sportster, I thought I was beginning to find some kind of peace with my decision. The empty space in my garage no longer felt like a reproach, and I'd even started taking my fat boy out for short rides around the neighborhood. But I had no idea that Tommy had been busy telling my story to people who would soon change my understanding of what family really means. It was a Saturday morning in late June, and I was in my front yard trying to convince myself to care about the lawn that hadn't been mowed in 3 weeks. The grass was getting complaints from the homeowners association, but everything felt like such an effort since Jessica died. I was pushing the mower in half-hearted strokes when I heard it, a distant rumble that made me stop and listen. At first, I thought it might be a freight train, but the sound was wrong, too irregular, too organic. Then it got louder, and I recognized the distinctive sound of motorcycle engines, not just one or two, but many. The rumble grew until it seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet, and that's when I saw them. The first bike turned onto my street at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. A big Harley with a bearded rider, wearing the colors I'd learned to recognize, the Death's Head patch of the Hells Angels. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came another bike, then another, then 10 more. Soon, my quiet suburban street was filled with motorcycles, riders in leather vests, lining both sides of the road like some kind of honor guard. I stood frozen in my front yard, holding the mower handle, watching as more than 100 bikers filled every available space on Maple Street. Neighbors began emerging from their houses, some looking nervous, others curious, all of them reaching for their phones to capture what was clearly an unprecedented event in our neighborhood. The lead rider pulled into my driveway and shut off his engine. When he removed his helmet, I saw it was Tommy Kowalski, but his expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. He climbed off his bike and walked toward me, and I noticed that every other rider stayed mounted, engines off, watching quietly. "Frank," Tommy said, extending his hand, "I hope you don't mind the surprise. My brothers wanted to meet you." I looked past him at the sea of leather and chrome filling my street. "All of them?" Tommy smiled for the first time since arriving. "All of them. See, when I told the chapter about Jessica, about what she did over there, about what you've been going through, well, we take care of our own. And Jessica was one of ours, even if she never wore our colors." Before I could ask what he meant, Tommy gestured to the other riders. One by one, they began shutting off their engines and dismounting. But instead of the intimidating crowd I might have expected, I found myself facing a diverse group of men and women, young and old, who approached with the kind of respect usually reserved for church or funeral homes. The first to reach me was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a braid. "Mr. Castellano," she said, "my name is Linda Patterson. I lost my son in Iraq 6 years ago. He was a helicopter mechanic, 24 years old. Tommy told us about Jessica, and we wanted you to know that her sacrifice matters to people she never met. Behind Linda came others, each with their own story of loss or struggle. Miguel Santos had lost his daughter to cancer. Robert Chen's brother had died in a motorcycle accident. Sarah Williams was raising her grandson alone after her son overdosed. But what struck me wasn't just their individual tragedies. It was the way they'd found family in each other, the way they'd built something strong from the pieces of their broken hearts. "We're not what people think we are," said Jake Morrison, a tall man with kind eyes who introduced himself as the chapter president. "Yeah, we ride hard and we look tough, but mostly, we're just people who understand that life hits everyone eventually. The difference is, we don't face it alone." Tommy stepped forward, and I noticed he was carrying a leather jacket I didn't recognize. "Frank, the chapter took a vote last week. We'd like to offer you membership as an honorary brother. You don't have to prospect. You don't have to earn your colors the usual way. What you've already given, your daughter, your service as her father, that's earned you a place here, if you want it." He held out the jacket, and I could see patches sewn onto the leather with careful precision. The main patch read, "Hell's Angels Riverside." But below it was another patch that made my throat tighten. "In memory of SSG Jessica Castellano." "We had this made special," Tommy explained. "Jessica was a warrior, and warriors deserve to be remembered by other warriors. If you want to ride with us, you'll carry her name and her honor everywhere you go." I took the jacket with hands that weren't quite steady. The leather was soft, broken in, and I realized it wasn't new. Someone had given up their own jacket to create this memorial for my daughter. "Whose jacket was this?" I asked. "Mine," said a quiet voice behind me. I turned to see a young man, maybe 25, with the kind of earnest face that reminded me of Jessica at that age. "I'm Danny Reeves. I've only been a member for 2 years, but when Tommy told us about your daughter, I knew I wanted to help. My jacket for her memory seemed like a fair trade." I looked around at these people, these Hell's Angels who were supposed to be outlaws and criminals, and saw something I hadn't expected. I saw the same thing I'd seen in Jessica's army unit when they'd attended her funeral. A chosen family, bound together by shared purpose and mutual protection. "There's something else," Jake Morrison said. "We know you've been struggling since Jessica died." Tommy told us about the empty garage, about how hard it's been to find a reason to keep riding. "So, we thought maybe you needed a mission." He gestured toward the street, where I noticed for the first time that several of the motorcycles had passengers, not riders, but cargo, boxes, bags, and containers secured to the backs of bikes. "Every month, our chapter does a supply run to the VA hospital in San Diego," Jake explained. "We bring comfort items for the veterans, books, toiletries, snacks, things the hospital budget doesn't cover. It's not glamorous work, but it matters to the guys who are stuck in there feeling forgotten." Tommy picked up the explanation. "We thought maybe Jessica would like knowing her dad was still taking care of soldiers, even if they're not the ones she was treating. Would you consider riding with us next weekend?" I put on the jacket Danny had given up for me, feeling the weight of Jessica's memory sewn into the leather. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for me to claim it. Around me, more than 100 bikers stood quietly, waiting for my answer. And I realized this was what Jessica would have wanted, not for me to hide in my garage mourning her, but to find a way to keep serving others in her name. "When do we leave?" I asked. The cheer that went up from the assembled riders could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Engines roared to life, horns honked, and suddenly, my quiet suburban street sounded like the starting line of a motorcycle rally. But underneath all that noise, I heard something else. The sound of a community welcoming a new member home. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at my side, tears streaming down her face. "Frank," she whispered, "look what you've found. Look what Jessica brought you." Over the next hour, the Hell's Angels slowly dispersed, but not before each member had introduced themselves personally and shared their phone numbers. Family takes care of family. Each one said in their own way, "Call if you need anything." Tommy was the last to leave. "Next Saturday," he reminded me, 8 o'clock in the morning, we meet at the clubhouse and ride to San Diego together. Bring your fat boy and wear that jacket. Jessica's going to love seeing the country from the back of her dad's bike again. As I watched him ride away, I realized something had fundamentally changed. For the first time since those officers knocked on my door, I was looking forward to something. Not because my grief was gone, it would always be with me, but because I'd found a way to transform it into purpose. That night, I called my brother in Phoenix, the first family member I'd spoken to in weeks. "Tony," I said, "you're not going to believe what happened today. I joined a motorcycle club." "You did what?" Tony's voice was incredulous. "Frank, you're 62 years old. Isn't it a little late for a midlife crisis?" I looked at Jessica's memorial patch sewn onto my new jacket, hanging on the chair beside me. "It's not a midlife crisis, Tony. It's a midlife awakening. I found my tribe." The next morning, I was in my garage before sunrise, not sitting and staring at empty spaces, but preparing my fat boy for the road ahead. I cleaned every chrome surface, checked the tire pressure, and made sure the engine was running perfectly. For the first time in months, I had somewhere important to be. I didn't know it yet, but that supply run to the VA hospital would become a monthly pilgrimage that would change not just my life, but the lives of dozens of veterans who would come to know the Hells Angels as family. And Jessica's memory, carried on a patch sewn to leather, would ride thousands of miles and touch hundreds of lives in ways I was only beginning to understand. The healing had begun, not through forgetting or moving on, but through remembering with purpose and riding towards something bigger than my own pain. 6 months after the Hells Angels filled my street and changed my life, I was sitting in the VA hospital in San Diego, playing cards with a Marine named Roberto Valdez who'd lost both legs to an IED in Fallujah. It was our third monthly supply run, and I'd learned that the real mission wasn't just delivering care packages. It was delivering hope to men and women who sometimes felt forgotten by the world they'd served. "So let me get this straight, Frank," Roberto said, dealing another hand of poker with the practiced ease of someone who'd had plenty of time to perfect his card skills. "You're telling me that the Hells Angels, the actual Hells Angels, adopted you because your daughter died in Afghanistan?" I adjusted the memorial patch on my jacket, something I'd gotten in the habit of doing whenever someone mentioned Jessica. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And now I spend my weekends riding with outlaws and delivering toothbrushes to heroes." Roberto laughed, a sound that filled the recreation room and drew smiles from other patients. Man, if someone had told me when I was deployed that I'd be getting care packages from a biker gang, I'd have recommended them for a psych eval. "We prefer motorcycle club," I said with mock seriousness, then smiled. But yeah, it's not exactly what I expected from my golden years either. The truth was, these monthly rides had become the anchor that kept me steady. Every third Saturday, I'd meet the Riverside chapter at the clubhouse, and we'd make the 2-hour ride to San Diego, loaded down with donations from local businesses, churches, and individual contributors who'd heard about our mission. Word had spread through the veteran community, and now other MC chapters from across Southern California joined us on different months, creating a rotating schedule that ensured the VA got regular deliveries year-round. But the real transformation wasn't in what we brought to the hospital, it was in what the hospital gave back to us. Every visit reminded me that Jessica's sacrifice was part of something bigger than my personal grief. Every conversation with a wounded veteran connected me to the larger community of people who understood the cost of service and the value of standing together. Tommy found me in Roberto's room around 3 o'clock. "Frank, you ready to head back? We're forming up in the parking lot in 10 minutes. I shook hands with Roberto and promised to see him next month. He'd been working with prosthetics and hoped to be walking again soon, maybe even riding again someday. I'd already talked to Jake Morrison about helping Roberto get his motorcycle license once he was ready. "Hey, Frank," Roberto called as I reached the door. "Tell Jessica, thanks for sending you to us, okay? We needed you more than you know." Outside, in the parking lot, the familiar sight of 20-plus motorcycles warming up filled me with a contentment I hadn't felt since before Jessica deployed. Linda Patterson was organizing the empty boxes and bags that had held our donations. Miguel Santos was checking his bike's tire pressure for the ride home. Danny Reeves, the young man who'd given up his jacket for Jessica's memorial, was deep in conversation with Jake Morrison about route planning. These people had become more than friends. They'd become the family I'd needed when my world fell apart, the support system that caught me when I was falling and showed me how to fly again. And they'd taught me something crucial about grief, that it doesn't have to be a solitary burden. Shared with the right people, grief becomes purpose, pain becomes power. Loss becomes love in action. "Mount up, brothers," Jake called out. "Time to take these bikes home." The ride back to Riverside was one of those perfect Southern California afternoons, when the sky stretches endlessly blue and the mountains rise like promises on the horizon. I found myself in the middle of the pack, surrounded by the rumble of engines and the companionship of people who'd taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding new ways to honor what you've lost. Halfway home, we stopped at a roadside diner that had become our traditional halfway point. As we filed in, still wearing our colors and patches, I noticed the mix of reactions from other customers. Some looked nervous, others curious, a few openly hostile. But the waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, recognized us immediately. "You're the guys who go to the VA hospital," she said, approaching our table with coffee already in hand. "My nephew's been telling me about you. He's in rehabilitation there, working on walking again after losing his leg in Syria. He said you brought him books and spent time just talking with him." "What's your nephew's name?" Tommy asked. "James Patterson. Jimmy. He's my sister's boy, 23 years old. Was going to be a teacher before he enlisted." Linda looked up sharply. "Patterson? Is he related to you?" The waitress nodded. "He's my nephew." "Why?" Linda smiled and pointed to her own last name patch. "Linda Patterson. I think Jimmy and I might be distant cousins. I've been visiting someone else at the VA, but I'd love to meet him next month." And that's how it always was with this group. Connections appearing in unexpected places. Family trees growing new branches. The circle of care expanding naturally. By the time we finished our coffee and pie, the waitress was talking about organizing a fundraiser at the diner to help buy adaptive equipment for wounded veterans. Back on the road, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Jessica's commanding officer at her funeral. He'd told me that Jessica died doing what she'd trained for, protecting others, serving something bigger than herself. At the time, those words felt hollow, like empty consolation offered by someone who'd never lost a child. But now, 6 months into this new life with the Hells Angels, I was beginning to understand what he'd meant. Jessica's death hadn't been meaningless. It had been part of a larger commitment to service that didn't end when her deployment ended. It had rippled outward, touching my life, Tommy's life, the lives of everyone in our chapter who'd been moved by her story. And that ripple effect kept expanding. The VA runs had inspired other chapters to start similar programs. The story of Jessica's memorial patch had spread through veteran networks, leading to connections with Gold Star families across the country. My garage, once a shrine to silence and loss, had become a workshop where chapter members gathered to repair bikes for veterans who couldn't afford professional service. When we pulled into the Riverside Clubhouse parking lot that evening, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that would have made Jessica reach for her camera. She'd been the photographer in our family, always trying to capture perfect moments to preserve forever. "Same time next month?" Danny asked as we shut down our engines. Wouldn't miss it, I replied, and meant it completely. Jake Morrison gathered the group for our usual post-ride debrief. Good run today, everyone. Frank, the hospital administration wanted me to tell you that your daughter's story has inspired 3 more medical professionals to volunteer at the VA. They said knowing about Jessica's service reminded them why they went into healthcare in the first place. I felt the familiar tightness in my throat that came whenever someone mentioned Jessica's continuing impact. She would have liked that. I managed to say, she always said healing was a team sport. As the group dispersed, and I prepared to ride home alone, Tommy pulled me aside. Frank, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. My brother Danny, the one I lost in Afghanistan, his unit served with Jessica's unit for 3 months. I found out last week when I was going through some of his letters. They knew each other. They worked together. He handed me a photo that looked like it had been taken in a field hospital. There was Jessica, younger and wearing desert camouflage, smiling beside a group of soldiers. And there, unmistakably, was a young man who shared Tommy's features and smile. I thought you should have this, Tommy said quietly. Turns out our kids were watching out for each other over there, just like we're watching out for each other here. I studied the photo, seeing Jessica in her element, surrounded by the people she'd chosen to serve alongside. She looked happy, purposeful, exactly like the daughter I'd raised to believe that life was about more than just personal happiness. Riding home alone that night, Jessica's memorial patch visible in my peripheral vision, I realized that I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Not closure. Grief doesn't close. It just changes shape. Not healing. Some wounds are meant to stay tender. But purpose. Direction. A way to honor Jessica's memory that didn't require me to move on from missing her, but instead allowed me to move forward with her. The Hells Angels had taught me that family isn't just about blood relations or shared genetics. It's about shared values, mutual protection, and the willingness to show up for each other when the world gets heavy. They taught me that service doesn't end when tragedy strikes. It evolves, adapts, finds new expressions. Most importantly, they taught me that Jessica's story wasn't over just because her life had ended. Every month, as we rode to the VA hospital with supplies and stories and hope, she was riding with us. Every veteran we visited, every connection we made, every moment of healing we facilitated, all of it was part of her continuing mission to help others. I pulled into my driveway as the last light faded from the sky, but for the first time in almost a year, I wasn't afraid of the darkness. Tomorrow was Sunday, and I had calls to make. To the diner waitress about her fundraiser idea. To the VA about expanding our program. To other Gold Star parents who might need to know that grief shared is grief transformed. Jessica was gone, but her work continued. And I had found my place in carrying it forward, 1 mile at a time, surrounded by angels who wore leather jackets and rode Harleys into the sunset. Thank you for keeping these stories of love, resilience, and family alive. I'm deeply grateful to all of you for listening to this journey. We'll see you again in the next touching story from those who found strength in the hardest moments.